Hello and welcome. UVA Speaks is a podcast of Lifetime Learning, a division of the Office of Engagement at the University of Virginia. Lifetime Learning brings the knowledge and expertise of UVA's faculty to the university's alumni, friends, and families. My name is Susan Lynch, and I am the Associate Director of Lifetime Learning at the University of Virginia's Office of Engagement. This podcast features Kelsey Johnson, a professor of astronomy at the University of Virginia, affiliate faculty in the Department of Religious Studies, and currently serving as the Associate Dean of Undergraduate Education in the College of Arts and Sciences. She's the past president of both the American Astronomical Society and the Astronomical Society of the Pacific, and the founding director of the award-winning Dark Skies Bright Kids program. She has won numerous awards for her teaching, research, and promotion of science literacy. And her TED Talk on the importance of dark skies has more than 2 million views, and her writing has appeared in nationwide publications, including the New York Times, Scientific American, and the Washington Post. In January of this year, Professor Johnson was a speaker at a Lifetime Learning virtual event entitled Mysteries of the Cosmos, Science, Philosophy, and the Big Questions. And we received so many questions from participants that we couldn't get to during that event. So in this podcast, Professor Johnson will be expanding upon the remaining questions and answer some of those unanswered questions. So thank you so much, Professor, for speaking with me today.
Oh, it's so fun to be here, Susan. Thank you for having me.
Great. Thank you so much. So first, we're going to start with a broad, but perhaps one of the most important questions we can ask. And do you think we will ever know the answer to questions like, where did the universe come from?
I love that you picked that question right out of the gate. Probably the biggest question that has vexed humanity literally for like millennia, right?
Right.
So do I ever think there will be a question? Do I ever think there will be an answer? I think there will always be questions. Where did the universe come from? Some of these questions are so deeply vexing because they bring us to the boundary of what we know in modern physics and even what we can conceive of in modern philosophy. And so for questions like this, like where did the universe come from? It could very well be that there are fundamental limits in our current understanding of physics, and possibly in physics full on, that we will never be able to see past. I always want to use the word never with a little bit of pause and a little bit of humility, because you never know what discoveries the next generation might make, or what discoveries we might have in 100 or 1,000 years. And I never want to be that calcified old scientist that's just curmudgeonly and says things are impossible, right? I always want to leave a window open for things to be possible. But as things stand now, and as developed as our brains may be, there are some questions that I just cannot find a way out of. And this is one of them. Like philosophically, where the universe came from brings us straight into what's called infinite regression. And even if I could tell you, there are lots of hypotheses on the table for where the universe might have come from. And let's say I could tell you the answer, which I can't, just to be clear, but I could make up an answer and I could say, Bob snapped his fingers and the universe came into existence. Well, I think any thinking person, one of the next questions that's going to come to mind is, well, where did Bob come from and why did he snap his fingers? Right. And so we just never quite get to the bottom of this. There's an analogy which is turtles all the way down, and there's always another turtle behind whatever explanation we have. And it's hard to find a way out of it, which brings us to this question of, why do we have something instead of nothing? And that's a whole interesting can of worms in and of itself. And I spend a whole day in class when I teach this material talking about different types of nothing, because it turns out you have to talk about nothing with great precision if you're going to try to address this question. But even then, we can't get very far. I often hear from people with this particular unanswerable question, where did the universe come from? And why do we have something, how can we possibly have something from nothing? Often a refrain I will get from people is, well, we've just always had something. And why isn't that the explanation? And I can't prove that wrong, right? Maybe that's true, but it's deeply unsatisfying for me. And I don't think I'm the only one, because then we're left having to explain, well, why do we have this something and not some other something? Right. So we still haven't really given ourselves the explanatory power that, you know, I am really curious about, and I don't think I'm alone. That being said, there are all of these questions that may never be answerable. Maybe they will be, and I'll be wrong, and that will be a very interesting day. But I also think there's something really important about having these questions that are outside of our human ability to address. And there's, I don't know exactly what that is, but it gives us, I think it reminds us that we're part of something bigger. And it keeps curiosity front and center, and it invokes humility, right? That we are not the masters of the universe.
Right. And some of us are just more comfortable with that question being unanswered, I guess. It feels so beyond my scope that I'm like, well, I'm just okay with that question being out there.
But do you still give yourself permission to think about it? That's what's interesting
Sure,
for me.
sure,
It's
sure,
even if it's unanswerable, do you let yourself think about it?
sure. Yeah, absolutely. But I'm not often coming from a science base of it. So, thank you. So, why do you think these existential questions are important for us to think about? Especially uh, if we're not able to answer them.
That's a really good question, and that is one that I'm asked a lot when I wear my astronomer hat. Um, I, I think about this from a couple different angles. One is, if we assume things are unanswerable because they at least appear to be to our modern abilities, that becomes self-fulfilling, right? We just stop trying to answer it. And so I think that that's actually kind of stupid. So let's not just assume that things are unanswerable. Let's just keep working on it and keep seeing if we can find a new angle to open something up. But I do think, even if something is truly fundamentally unanswerable, and maybe any sentient species in the universe would never be able to answer it under any circumstances, I think there's still real value in being curious for curiosity's sake. I wonder sometimes that in our modern world, we've got to the point where everything only has a value if it's able to produce something. And often, as a scientist, I hear this all the time, especially with astronomy. Like, what is the value of astronomy? What have you done for us? Like, what new medicine have you created? What technology have you developed? And I will say, as a good astronomer, right, astronomy has led to a number of fabulous inventions that humans have benefited from. And we're not going to talk about them all right now, because that's not what this podcast is about. And I don't want to make it about that. But I think that the bottom line is, even with these unanswerable questions, being curious is an end to itself. And I hate it when we feel like we have to justify curiosity because of some other thing it might lead to or produce. That just rings really hollow to me. And why can't we let ourselves be curious? Because being curious is fun. It's part of being human. It's part of exploring our world. It's part of feeling like you're part of something bigger. So I'm a big fan of being curious. I also think, and putting my teacher hat on here, that curiosity is fundamental for learning. And I happen to hold the position that learning is one of the most important things that we can do with our time on Earth. And I think it's very hard for people to want to learn, or set out to learn anything if you're not curious. And so curiosity to me is really important. But something we touched on before with respect to these big existential, potentially unanswerable questions, is that I think thinking about these, even if they're unanswerable, especially if they're unanswerable, is so good at reminding us that we are not the center of the universe. And I truly think that all of us can use more of that in our daily lives.
Humility, as you mentioned
Humility.
before. Absolutely.
Absolutely.
So very important. And when you were talking about curiosity, it made me think of of Ted Lasso and the comment, be curious, not judgmental. And
Yes.
I think that's such an important statement and concept that I try to remind myself of often.
I love that. Like I
Yeah.
should just get it painted on my wall, right? If we lead with curiosity in all things, instead of leading with asking a question to an end, right? It sets up a whole different way of approaching the world.
Absolutely. I agree completely. So, what is the role of interdisciplinary thinking in solving some of these mysteries? You know, you said your astronomer hat. Well, it sounds like you have many other hats. So, it sounds like you're very involved in interdisciplinary thinking. So,
Well, I'm a big fan. Yeah, I'm a product of a liberal arts school as an undergraduate, which surely influenced my view of education in the world. But I truly believe that interdisciplinary thinking is essential to making progress on anything that we do. It brings just different tools and ways of thinking and habits of mind and knowledge bases to bear on whatever it is we're trying to do. I worry a lot. I see this a lot with students, and I see it in my profession as well. Um, I worry a lot that we have placed so much value on very deep, very narrow educations and ways of thinking. Um, there are certainly students who will come to the university and, for example, only want to take physics and math classes. They have had it, in their brains. And I'm saying this as an astrophysicist, right? These are topics that are near and dear to me and that I love. But if you only take physics and math, right, you will have a very, very deep specialized knowledge, but in an incredibly narrow area. And you truly risk losing connective tissue and cross pollination that I think come from really rich, deep interdisciplinary thinking. And what I have found working with, one of my favorite things to do, and one of the reasons I absolutely love being at a university in general and at UVA in particular, is all the interaction I have with colleagues across grounds who have different roles, staff, faculty from different departments, different backgrounds. And the insane amount I can learn from other people that I would never have thought of. And I feel like this kind of rich interdisciplinary thinking, it leads to creativity, it leads to innovation, and ultimately those combinations will lead to insights and breakthroughs. So yes, of course, we need people who think, who drill down really, really, really deep in a particular niche subject. Yes, we need people like that. I'm not saying that we don't. But I think we need far more people who have a depth of knowledge that samples different parts of the terrain and can make new connections and new synergies and new, just develop brand new novel ideas that we can't do if we stay narrow and focused. So I guess this is a very long answer to your question, Susan, but I think if we want to make real breakthroughs in real unsolved territory and whatever the discipline is, we have to be more open to interdisciplinary thinking and learning different ways of thinking from our colleagues around grounds.
I agree completely. I also, in my undergraduate, I was a sociology major. I took as many classes as I could across different disciplines, history, psychology. I'm not a big hard science gal, but
Yet,
took
yet.
yet. Okay, yes. Um, so I took just a lot of classes across different things, and it gives you a different lens to think about things when you go into a different discipline and study
Mm-hmm.
something else. And it has changed ways that I think about things very differently. I see
Yeah, I
you
think it
also,
makes me a better scientist.
sure, yeah, I can imagine. I see you're also an affiliate in the Department of Religious Studies. So how
Mm-hmm.
does that come out in the work that you do here at UVA?
Well, it's one of those things where, again, because we are in a university, we get to have these incredibly valuable interactions with people in different departments. And there are so many things I think about that intersect with what people in the religious studies department are thinking about. Everything from, yes, the relationship between science and religion, and belief and spirituality and how all of those things are connected. And that seems like a pretty obvious place to be. And I think that is an incredibly important topic in our society. But also other things like the role of awe and experiencing awe. And I'm in collaboration with some folks in religious studies, particularly Curtis Schaefer and Martine Halverson Taylor. We've started a whole project on awe, and one of our hypotheses is that two of the things most likely to invoke awe in humans are some type of spiritual experience or exposure to the cosmos. And there are lots of other things that are in there too, but we really want to drill down about what is it about facing the existential when you face, a spiritual experience or when you're encountering the universe that really have bearing on the experience of awe. And it turns out, and there's been a lot of work on this in recent decades, that experiencing awe is really important for human flourishing. And as a society, we're becoming awe deprived. So this is, that's just one area of work. I'm really interested in what's called exotheology, which has to do with what implications are there for theologies on Earth if extraterrestrial life were discovered, which is, I think, super interesting. And I'm super interested in the ethics of outer space, and what that means for humans on the globe. So there's just all this really rich interdisciplinary thinking that I love.
Wow, that's great. So interesting. Um, so what is one of the greatest mysteries that you think is least appreciated?
Oh, there are some great mysteries that I think get a lot of press, and a lot of people think about, like, where did the universe come from, right? That one is almost so trite that people make fun of it, even though I don't think you should make fun of it. The one mystery that I think most people probably don't even think about because it's just so obvious. It's like we're fish sitting in water. It's time. I would argue that time and the nature of time is the one thing about the universe that we simultaneously have the most exposure to, right? We've been experiencing time our whole lives, right? There's never been a time when we weren't experiencing time, and the least understanding of, right? Time is this thing in physics that is such an enigma. In modern physics, we've started to get more of a handle on it. It used to be 100 years or so ago that time was entirely in the realm of philosophy. That has changed. Right now, physics has some things to say about it. But the nature of time and why time behaves the way it does, why time, we often talk in astrophysics about the fabric of space-time, by which we mean that space and time are actually really fundamentally intertwined. But we don't understand why time has manifest differently than space. We don't understand why in space we appear to have the ability to, go forward or backward or left or right or up or down, right? We have a choice there, but with time we don't. At least if you think you have a choice in the direction you go in time, please do let me know. But except for maybe some crazy people, most people don't think they have a choice about the direction they're going in time. We don't understand what the flow of time is, whether it truly is a flow. Um, there are parts of physics that suggest that the future already exists and the past still exists in a very real sense. And if that's true, then why do we find ourselves experiencing the slice of time that we do? But there's just so much about time that is just fundamentally not understood. And it's so slippery to get our hands around because we're embedded in it. And we don't even, in some ways, have the language to talk about it because we can't get outside of time to talk about it. So time is one of those things that I would truly love to have a better understanding of. And I think I'm not the only one.
Right. Fascinating. So if you were posing this in your classroom, what would your students be coming up with around this whole concept of time? I mean, how are they challenging you on these kinds of things or asking you for
Students have a really, it's really fun to ask students to think about time because it is something that I think a lot of people don't think about outside of like science fiction,
Yeah,
right? In
sure.
which case you're not really, it was great when the movie Interstellar came out. I don't know if you watched Interstellar.
I
Um,
have just recently, actually.
oh, that's fabulous.
Yeah,
But when students watch that, it gets them thinking about time in some different ways. But one of the first things I do when I'm teaching about time is I ask my students to try to define time,
right.
right? And even defining it, when you try to define it, it becomes very, very slippery. But I think one of the fun things about teaching about time is that there aren't any right answers. I mean, there are some wrong answers, but there aren't any right answers. And so there's room for students, I think, to think creatively. And often when we're talking about concepts like time that are so incredibly abstract, and despite the fact that we experience it continuously, the physics of time and the malleability of time sort of sit outside of our ability to understand it, that you can almost feel, when you're teaching them some material with students, you can almost feel their brains like trying to expand in real time,
Right.
right? And it can be an uncomfortable experience, I think, for students, but I think it's a really valuable experience. And when we talk about time, it's one of those topics that I really work with them to be like, your brain might not feel comfortable, right? This might feel really deeply hard because it is deeply hard and it's not going to make sense. And you might even feel like you have gears in your head that are stuck, that aren't turning the way they're supposed to turn. And that's all okay. And that's all normal. But part of that is your brain literally trying to find a way to accommodate this information. And that's what learning is.
Right.
And when you prime the brain for that kind of like deep, really deep, meaningful learning, right? We're not just memorizing facts, right? We're literally trying to establish new neural pathways in a brain to accommodate concepts that haven't lived there before. Like that's gold as a teacher. So I love that.
And you have students from all across grounds, right, that are taking your classes? Yeah.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah,
Um,
for sure.
yeah.
So they're bringing their different perspectives to that really deep question. That's great. That's great.
Well, it turns out even with physics or math students, um, there's very little in standard college curriculum. There's very little discussion of kind of the big existential questions. There's a lot of practical how to use this equation or solve that problem. But even students who have more experience in physics and math will come to the class and have that same sort of experience in their brains.
Great. Um, and finally, this question was posed by a registrant at the January program. And I'm also asking this today because it's one of the things that's been on my mind lately. And the question is, could there really be other dimensions? And you mentioned interstellar. Um, I think that's one of the things that they were talking about, sort of different dimensions. I don't know, maybe alternative timelines, if those are two different things, I don't know.
Mhm.
But are there other dimensions out there that we don't know or that we're coming to find, or that's the question.
Yeah, that is the question. And I love, I really do owe a debt of gratitude to some good science fiction books and movies for helping people think about this. Um, okay, short answer is yes.
Okay.
There are real physical reasons to think, right? I want to be careful. We don't know this, but there are real reasons to think that there may be other dimensions beyond the ones that we perceive. So most people I know perceive three dimensions of space and one dimension of time. So we have four dimensions that we sort of inhabit. We call it 3+1 because we like to sort of separate out time as behaving differently than space, even though we don't understand why it does. But there are physical hypotheses out there that we didn't just like wake up one morning and say, oh, what if we had five other dimensions, right? There are reasons why in physics, um, we've been pushed to consider whether there might be other dimensions as opposed to just having some science fiction dream. Um, and uh, and there are reasons to think why there are different kinds of dimensions that might exist. And I think one question at hand is whether, we have in the world we inhabit, we have spatial dimensions and we have one temporal dimension. So when we think about there possibly being other dimensions, we often think of them as either being spatial or temporal because those are the kinds of dimensions that we have experience with. But why would they have to be? Right? Are there still other kinds of dimensions that are neither spatial nor temporal that might be out there? Now, these other dimensions could take different forms. They could be what are called macroscopic. And what I mean by that is they're, big, expanded dimensions like we think of space or time, right? That sort of are infinite. Or actually, to be fair, we don't actually know space or time are infinite, but we think of them as being infinite, often in colloquial conversation. And maybe they just live sort of adjacent, outside of a hyperspace to the three dimensions of space that we inhabit. In fact, they could be just like a millimeter away from us in this other extra dimensionality. And as crazy as this sounds, there are some actual experiments happening now to try to test this in some low level ways. It's not easy to test because you're looking for possible signatures and ways that those dimensions might interact with our own. But here's the thing, right? If we want to see signatures of other dimensions, we have to be able to interact with them. And to be able to interact with them, that means that the forces that we have in our dimensionality have to be able to somehow extend beyond our dimensionality into this other dimensionality. And we don't know that that's possible. The one force that is such an odd duck and also taken very much for granted, kind of like time, is gravity. It turns out gravity is unbelievably weak. Excuse me. But there are some physical theories that suggest gravity could leak out of our dimensions into other dimensions. And in any case, some of this is testable and people are working to test it. So that's macroscopic. There could be these big macroscopic dimensions. But one of the things that's quite popular in physics these days is what's called string theory. And string theory has to do with what the most fundamental parts of matter are, of mass and energy are. And in string theory, the very lowest, most fundamental level of mass and energy has to do with vibrating strings, if you will, not literal strings, not like strings cats would play with, but strings of energy. But the key for these strings of energy in string theory is they require other dimensions to be vibrating in. And these other dimensions are what are called compactified, which means incredibly small, like so small that there's no way we could probe them with current physics experiments. But they would exist everywhere. So at every point in our three-dimensional space right now, there would be sort of a compactified extra set of dimensions. And again, there are real reasons to think in current physics theories that these might exist. And it may not be too far into the future before we can test it.
So in the movie Interstellar, there's this scene where Matthew McConaughey's character he's in this strange sort of tunnel type of thing, and he's looking through to his daughter who has grown up, seeing her he left Earth when she was young. She's now an adult woman, in science, doing, fascinating and interesting things. And he's watching her. And is that a dimension? Is that a parallel universe? Is that an alternate timeline? I mean, what are they trying to show there as he's viewing her from his time into, you know what I mean? I
Yeah.
wasn't sure what they were trying to, envision there. I thought it was interesting. I just didn't wasn't sure what the concept was.
Yeah, I think in some ways it's all of the above of the
Okay.
things you just listed. As we think about other dimensions, they could be, it could be parallel timeline, could be, we could think about that as another dimension. Um, what's interesting for me in Interstellar is that I don't know how if you know this or if your listeners will know this, but this is something Hollywood rarely does, but they actually consulted with some of the world's experts on black holes when they were creating that movie.
Okay.
And so they really did try to embed some of our physical understanding there. And in that scene that you're describing, that is a powerful scene.
Yeah.
What they're kind of evoking is what happens if you are inside of a black hole or a wormhole. And what's really interesting, this is one of the other great unsolved mysteries in the universe. I have a whole chapter on it in my book that came out last fall. What happens inside black holes? And we may never know the answer because, as far as we know right now, you can't get back out. But insofar as we can extrapolate our understanding of math and physics inside of black holes, one of the things that we believe to be true and mathematically holds true is that when you cross the boundary, what we call the boundary of a black hole, time itself, remember time, the slippery concept we were just talking about, time itself becomes literally imaginary. And so when you cross that boundary of a black hole, we start to play with concepts of space and time in a way that is radically counterintuitive. And I think that's a large part of what folks in Interstellar were playing with in that, I think, really, really important scene. But one of the things that brings to mind for me is, as we think about time and the way Matthew McConaughey sort of had a cross-cut vision of time in that scene, there could be dimensions outside of the four that we are familiar with that sort of sit outside of time, right? There's a almost a hyper dimension outside of time from which you could see all of the different times, right? And that type of hypothesis is totally on the table.
Right. Right. Wow. Fascinating. So here's the thing, Professor, is that we have these conversations and then there's more. There's so much more.
Good.
There's so much more that comes up. So we're going to have you on for even more programs. So thank you so much. Really, I really appreciated this conversation today and for you speaking with me and following up from the January event. These are such interesting concepts that really get the mind thinking and exploring. And so I really want to thank you for sharing your knowledge and expertise again with us, with UVA's alumni, friends, and families. I really appreciate it.
Always a pleasure. And I'm always happy to talk about these topics.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. And thank you so much to everybody for listening for upcoming podcasts and other lifetime learning programming, recordings, and blogs. Please visit our website at engagement.virginia.edu/learn. You can also find our podcasts on the Virginia Audio Collective, which is a network of UVA podcasts hosted by WTJU Radio and can be found at virginiaaudio.org. So thanks again, and we look forward to you taking part in future lifetime learning programs.